Sien treker chalhan math. Bien she goes near Sigegwin. Chulid on a gomnian shen law.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honour and a pleasure to introduce Deirdre Ní Chonghaile, who's a graduate of Oxford University, fine musician and musicologist from the Aran Islands, and coordinator of the ongoing community-based project Aransongs. Deirdre was previously NUI postdoctoral fellow in Celtic Studies and Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at NUI Galway. She's also been an Alan Lomax fellow in folk life studies at the Library of Congress and NHQ fellow at the University of Notre Dame. Deirdre's research interests include telling the story of the cultural lives of Irish-speaking immigrants in 19th and 20th century North America. In recent years, she's explored the potential of the digital humanities to give creative access to a very rich archive of Irish music and folkloric material that survives on both sides of the Atlantic. And her monograph on music collecting in Ireland will be published in 2021.
By the University of Wisconsin Press.
As a consultant, Deirdre has served Harvard University, the Library of Congress, English National Opera, Drew Theatre Company, and the Irish American Climate Project, among others. Tonight, she's going to share the story of Sean-Nós song among the Irish diaspora from Sligo to Pennsylvania, as documented in the Reverend Murray collection. Daniel J. Murray from Sligo and J.J. Lyons from Galway transcribed over 1,200 Sean-Nós songs from Irish speakers in Pennsylvania from 1884 to 1920s. And this extraordinary collection of manuscripts, which Deirdre has recovered, preserves pre-famine memory in Ireland, and her research illustrates the value of song as social document to reflect and record and bind musicians across centuries through recovery and performance. So the title of her lecture this evening is Mapping Song Through Time and Space. Reverend Daniel J. Murray collects Sean-Nós song in Pennsylvania, 1884 to 1935. I'm so delighted you're giving this lecture for SMI, Deirdre. I welcome you warmly on behalf of Council, members and colleagues and friends who have gathered here to listen to you and support you and learn more about your research. Our President-elect, Dr. John O'Flynn, is going to chair your lecture, so I'll hand over to him now to say a few words about the protocol for taking questions. Gurmil Mahagov.
So, good evening, everybody. You're very welcome. And just to say the protocols for this evening will be, first of all, please mute your microphones now. And then, of course, at the end, we can unmute them if people actually speak. But for the most part, what we're going to do is ask people, if they don't mind, please, to reserve your questions, and you can actually start putting the questions into the chat box there as we progress throughout, so that then at the end, what I can do is I can read the questions to Deirdre. If we decide to go to a little bit more informal format, perhaps we will do that, but I think it's best to actually do them through this chat format to begin with. So at the end of the lecture then, we'll have those questions, but in the meantime, can I also add to Lorraine's welcome and looking very much forward to Deirdre's talk.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome. I have seen a few names flashing up there of attendees scattered all over the place, from here in Connemara as far as Western Massachusetts and even California in there as well. So you guys are all very welcome. I am delighted to be asked to contribute to this series. So thank you to the Society for Musicology in Ireland for the invitation. And especially happy to be sharing this particular story with this audience, because I think it makes a very strong case for the place of music in history and the value of music for history and historians as well, for us to not forget to include music when we're talking about history, historical sources, etc. And it's been my sort of pleasure and delight to be down various rabbit holes over the years. But this one is the deepest and darkest yet. Almost as dark as the coal mines that are that occur or that are central to the story as well. So I'll explain first what I do, or how I've ended up working on material like this. I am a musician and a scholar. I'm a fiddle player, and I research Irish traditional music. And those two things go hand in hand. They complement each other, and they inform and enrich each other as well as practices. And a central theme of my work is voices. And I work to source voices in archives or communities. I work to help to generate platforms for them, and all of that builds towards enabling connections. So that communities can connect with their own heritage and their own practice, because oftentimes the material that lives in their minds and memories and in their practice might be documented and held elsewhere sometimes. So there can be a sense of distance, and it's something I know archivists feel very passionately about. The trope of archives being locked away is very unhelpful and not accurate, really, because we know there are so many people working to help build the connections between those materials and the practices that have carried right through history to the present day and onwards. I wanted to show you maybe two examples of projects that are in that space. And I have here two projects here that are examples, both from the west of Ireland. One is Jimmy O'Brien Moran, Dr. Jimmy O'Brien Moran, down in Waterford. He worked to retrieve the repertoire of a very well-known 19th century piper, Paddy Conneely from Galway. And Jimmy is a piper himself, and produced this CD with a very generous booklet in it full of information about Paddy Conneely. So that's an example of retrieving the repertoire of a single musician and of a time and a milieu. And the other example I'm showing you here is Oran ó Iris. Iris is northwest County Mayo, so that tip right out on the top of Connacht, at the northwest edge there. And the community there collaborated with Sligo and J.J and to conduct research on materials that were held in the archive in Dublin in the National Folklore Collection, and also with musicians locally in the community. And they were effectively repatriating the songs and music from their locality back into the community, and it being voiced and performed and played by local musicians as well, including the school children. So that was a project that Muinty Wongan led there. So two different examples there, one relating to maybe a single musician or even a single instrument as well, but then the other to an entire community. And the repertoire that they featured on that CD, actually some of it was sourced in America, in Chicago, from Mayo people from Eris who had emigrated and who were still alive in the 1930s when James Delargy was visiting there, and he was able to record them. So this is the space that I've been working in for some time now. So these interventions, you could call them, really we can describe as examples of restoration or repatriation. And the issues for me that keep coming to the fore when dealing with archives like these are discoverability and accessibility. So trying to find materials in the first place. And then if you're lucky enough to find out where they are, then it's generating that accessibility to them. So those are some of the themes of this whole story that I'll be sharing with you today. So the Reverend Daniel J. Murphy is the subject of my talk, or Donal O'Murchu, as you can see his signature there. He spelled O'Murchu with an O, not with a U, as people would commonly spell it today. And he liked to distinguish that. So that has been helpful now after the fact, because it took me quite some time to track him down in the first place, because Dan Murphy is a terribly common name, not just in Ireland, but in America as well, with the stone round Dan Murphy's door. So that was one of the reasons that it took me some time to track him down, was his name being so common. But just, I have a quote here at the bottom of the slide from Hugh Shields, who researched so much about narrative song in Ireland and traditional music in general, where he said it's profitable to reflect seriously on the best use that may be made of musical archives. And that's a question that we'll come back to towards the end of this talk, because this archive, when I came across it, and it was something of a chance discovery, I had no idea how large it was going to be. So that question now hangs in the air. What do we do with archives like these? So I'm going to share the story with you of how this collection that Reverend Murphy created, how it emerged. And I, for those of you who are familiar with Irish traditional music, the shorthand really for Reverend Murphy, and to signal his legacy, is to say that he's the Chief O'Neill of Sean-Nós song. And for those of you who don't know who Chief O'Neill is, he would be a very well-known collector of Irish traditional music, but specifically of instrumental music. He was the chief of police in Chicago, and he discovered that down the street from him was Sergeant James O'Neill, and together they worked over a 24-year period to document Irish traditional music in Chicago. They had a collaboration that relied on their respective abilities. Chief O'Neill knew a lot of musicians, but he was reliant on James O'Neill to transcribe the music. And so far as I understand, neither of them would have been so literate in Irish. So we're not seeing them focusing on song in the way that the Reverend Murphy was. So the Chief O'Neill is regarded as a major collector of traditional music, and in the same way we're coming to see that the Reverend Daniel J. Murphy's a major collector of Irish song in either language. But the scale of the collection really is remarkable, because where O'Neill had 1,800 tunes or so, Father Murphy has over 1,200 songs, and those are individual songs, and some of those would have multiple performances that had been documented. So they're operating around the same time. Interestingly, Chief O'Neill started 1884, finished up around 1908. So that's a 24-year period, and Father Murphy there and his collaborators are active from 1884 also, but they carry on for a longer period into the 1920s. So the other similarity there is the fact that the populations that they're encountering, the performers they're encountering, immigrants from Ireland, the performers are famine survivors. So what they have in their heads is the pre-famine memory of Ireland. And that's especially significant for lyrics, one might say, because of the social history that would be reflected in the songs that people knew and carried with them and then performed in America. There are around about 450 singers in the Reverend Murphy collection, and I'm not sure that we are in a position to enumerate how many Chief O'Neill had documented from, but in any case, it's useful to bear Chief O'Neill's legacy in mind when we're talking about the significance of Murphy's legacy. So just to give you an idea of where Father Murphy was working, there's downtown Philadelphia for the urban setting, and then it's up in coal country, anthracite mining in eastern Pennsylvania around Carbon County and places like that. So south of Scranton, as you can see on the map. This is a very early effort on my part to try to begin to map where these various performers were located at different times. And what this reflects really is the history of immigrants coming into that state and the kind of work that they were that they found when they were there, what was happening industry-wise in the locality. There's an interesting difference to point out in relation to the Chief O'Neill collection and the Father Murphy collection, and it is that there's a lot of detail in Father Murphy's collection. So the reason I'm able to pinpoint them on the map here is because the addresses are given, and that doesn't necessarily always happen in sources of this period or of any period for that matter. And not only that, say there's an address there in Allentown, Pennsylvania, we'll also be told where an individual is from in Ireland down to the native parish. And for the women, their maiden names are given along with their married names also. So the level of detail matched with the scale is quite remarkable, really. Also, to look at the mix of people and where they're coming from, then it means that this collection is quite unlike contemporary collections that would have been in Ireland, in the sense that when Father Murphy went down the street in Philadelphia or went to a meeting where he knew Irish people would be, they could be from very different counties in Ireland and have different dialects and different repertoires. And for a person working in Ireland in the same period to access the same diversity, they would have had to travel quite a bit, and it would have been fairly challenging to arrive at the same diversity. So that provides a very interesting point of investigation for us looking at the materials. And another interesting point is the fact that he's a priest, a figure of authority in the community. So he had a particular level of access in the sense that people may have found it difficult to refuse a request coming from a priest. Please sing me a song or something. Yes, Father. so the that factor is interesting, also because there wouldn't have been any issue to have had a priest in the company of the woman of the house while the man of the house was out at work. There was no issue with having a man, a priest in the same house with the woman all day, maybe collecting or transcribing songs from her. So all of these providing interesting points for us to consider in looking at the collection. So Father Murphy, Dan Murphy as his family know him, is from County Sligo, from Kilmactyghe, which is a little corner of Sligo that's sort of almost surrounded by County Mayo, down South Sligo, near Swinford. And he's born in 1858, and he is one of 10 children. And in many ways, it's a classic Irish story. 8 of them emigrated, and 1 inherited the farm, stayed at home. And then 1 died in mysterious circumstances. A brother of Dan is said to have been shot by accident by the son of a local Protestant land agent. So there's a theory going that maybe Dan was encouraged to emigrate for fear he might try to exact retribution for his brother's death. We don't know yet. In any case, Dan emigrated and ended up in Philadelphia. His sisters were in Pittsburgh. His brother James was up in New Haven in Connecticut. But the other thing I'd like to point out on this slide is the house where they were reared. This is a typical house or cottage of the period, well, except that it has a slate roof now. But the road that you see passing in the front of the house is the main road going into a nearby market town called Clare. And at the far gable, that just is almost out of picture, was a small boreen going up the side of the mountain. And the Father Murphy's relatives told me that the people passing by the front door coming in for a visit would speak in English, and the people coming down from the mountains would come in the back door speaking Irish. So this was a bilingual house, and this is a period of language shift in Ireland post-famine. So interesting to see how those kinds of dynamics were playing out at the time. So Dan, when he arrives in America, he enters the seminary, the Charles Borromeo Seminary, St. Charles Borromeo Seminary, excuse me, just outside Philadelphia. And you might say, why did he do that? Well, there were priests on his mother's side of the family, but the other reason, and as he put it himself, was go bhfuil grím scóige ólas, which means to grip knowledge by the throat. So a rather dramatic way of saying that he wanted to educate himself, and as we know, entering the religious orders was one route for people into education at that time. Certainly people coming from his background, rural background in the west of Ireland. And at that time in Philadelphia, I just have some numbers here to give you an idea. It's estimated that in 1890s America, there would have been 400,000 Irish speakers. And an estimate for about 1899 is that there were 40,000 Irish speakers in Philadelphia. Now, Pennsylvania in general had a lot of people coming from Donegal and Mayo, if we look at the chain migration patterns that were there. And so we know that this is one of the places that Father Murphy was when he first landed in the States. And you might say, how did all of these Irish people or these Irish speakers, did they encounter each other? And there were precursors of the Gaelic League in America at the time, known as Philo-Celtic societies. And these were fora for people to come together and not necessarily to learn Irish per se. Some of them were native speakers, of course, in which case what they were accessing was literacy in their own language. So there's an extract here describing the Philadelphia branch of the society. This is from around 1886, that it had around 80 members, and the secretary, John Robinson, wrote that it was comprised of nearly 80 members, from children of 7 to old men, all either reading or conversing in the language of their forefathers. So that's interesting to see that you have multiple generations and what the motivations would be for people. For some of them trying to maintain some sense of Irish identity, and that the language was one way of doing that in a diasporic setting where they're of course surrounded by many other languages, but English as well being the language of commerce. So the society that I'm talking about, the Philo-Celtic Society of Philadelphia, here on the left of the screen you'll see the minute book from that society, and these don't always survive, but this one does, and it occurs in the Reverend Murphy collection because he was for a time the librarian for the society, which stands to reason. And on the right what you see is an image from a journal called An Gael, and An Gael was both of these, the society in Philadelphia and An Gael, were founded in 1881, and An Gael became a channel of communication for Irish speakers. It was a bilingual journal, but for anybody interested in Irish material, current affairs, literature, it's very broad sweep across the whole journal. But it was being produced in Brooklyn in New York, and the editor was a Galway man called Micheál O'Loughlin, or Michael J. Logan. So these are giving us traces of the activities of Irish speakers in America at the time, and it's a very interesting way to try and map those activities and see the networks emerging. So that's a glimpse of the urban activities Gael obviously would have spread beyond. And Father Murphy was also in rural Pennsylvania, as I've said. So here's an example where he was in Audenried in Carbon County in Pennsylvania. So this is up in the Anthracite Hills. And he is contributing an item to the journal Gael. And it's a nice little story where this is very early on. It's 1886. So he's still probably feeling that that emigrant pull to home. He talks about walking out of an evening and remembering a prayer that his grandmother used to say at night when they were closing the day, effectively. So a glimpse there of him pining for home, maybe, but remembering it, and also that it's through Irish. And then he's submitting it to Gael as an item of interest for them. So this region is very significant for the Irish in the 19th century in general in America, especially through the 1860s and 1870s, because there are glimpses of the Irish language occurring in those communities. So I've just pulled some of them together here. There's mentions of judges in the 1850s hearing evidence during cases, evidence through Irish. But these are men who are the sons of Irish people. In other words, they're American born, but clearly they were in households where they'd heard enough Irish that they felt they could hear evidence through Irish. So there's one example. Another, again from the 1850s, but in Carbondale in Pennsylvania, a place that was said to have had so many Irish speakers that it was nicknamed Connacht, or Connacht, the province of Connacht. And that Sunday Mass would have been said through Irish by Father O'Shaughnessy and Father Prendergast. Some of these mentions occur in this journal and other journals of the period. Another story about a priest, a young priest, hearing 500 confessions through Irish. Again, in the same region. I don't have the precise location for that little nugget, but a young priest would have had a special blessing in his confession. So there's another reason, apart from the language, of wanting to confess through their native languages. So we have these glimpses, and it can be difficult to trace them, but together there's a pattern there for sure, and it's encouraging us to dig a little deeper and search a bit more. So at this point, I want to introduce Father Murphy's collaborator, J.J. Lyons. And J.J., it's likely that they met through the Philo-Celtic Society, but J.J. had been collecting by 1884 at the latest. And here's an example on screen of his penmanship, both in Irish and in English, which is significant in that period. For those of you who aren't aware, the Irish language would not have been on any formal school curriculum in Ireland until about 1904. And anybody that was teaching it prior to that, any literacy in Irish, shall we say, that was a personal choice made by the teachers in respect of their students. So to have native Irish speakers who are literate in their own language in the 19th century is uncommon. And when we see this level of literacy, it's pointing to a particular level of education and also a particular interest as well. So that does raise an interesting question around where JJ might have got his literacy. And I'm very grateful to John Young of Colorado, who shared with me this photograph of his great-grandfather, I think it's one great, who is Luke Comer. And Luke was teaching in this school here, the tall building in the foreground, or Stonetown National School in Glenamaddy, outside Glenamaddy in County Galway. And he was teaching JJ. There's a reference in Gael that explains that connection there, whereby he and his brother were sending him a subscription to Gael. So almost a tribute, one would say, to the education that Luke gave him. And again, Glenamaddy, these are places that would have been Irish speaking at the time. So this school would have been in the diocese of Tuam. Tuam would be just up the road from Glenamaddy, but the map here shows roughly the diocese of Tuam, which is quite large and includes the islands as well. And Archbishop John McHale, who's pictured there, when the National Schools Act came in Ireland, he opposed it on the grounds that the schools were going to be non-denominational, and that was a threat to his control of the diocese. And so for me, the period whereby Tuam continued to be outside of the national loop in terms of school curriculum, that raises the possibility that there potentially the teachers had maybe some freedom in a sense to go their own way. It's very, very difficult to secure evidence for this possibility, we'll say, but the pins on the map represent the places where collectors or editors in respect of Irish language material in the 19th century were from or based. And I think it's interesting that that there's a clutch of them there coming from the Diocese of Tuam. Some of the others that would be represented there would be John Hannon and MJ Lovern. MJ Lovern, I think, was in Scranton for a period, if memory serves. So just to now look at the relationship between JJ and Father Murphy, and it seems to be something of the master and the apprentice, perhaps, that JJ was older, but they're in correspondence. This is Dan writing to JJ, a Charil she has here, and the underlined bit, he says, Ní han gardín íbnis go bailach an teach mór lúmse, saying this big bare old house is no paradise. So a reflection there of how restrictive life was in the seminary. And I'm sure that this the friendship, the connection with community in Philadelphia for Dan was something of a lifeline. And for JJ, there's an extract in a letter that he wrote to John Glynn, who was the editor of a column in a newspaper back in Ireland, a newspaper called the Tuam News, which was the first to have a column dedicated to the Irish language at all, I think, if memory serves. But his manuscripts are in the National Library, and they're very interesting because everyone was corresponding with him. And here, I'll read the translation where JJ is referring to Father Murphy, saying, this is a young priest from County Sligo. He's a great scholar of Irish, and if he lives, I believe no other scholar in this country will be as good as him. He and I are very friendly. So it seems to me that JJ may well have prompted Dan to collect, and that Dan then took up the mantle then later. Just some examples here of the people from whom JJ transcribed here. There's a Mrs. Kelly from Kenmare, County Kerry, Oran Verica. And then the following poem was written in Philadelphia from the recitation of Patrick Flesk, a young boy arrived here lately from Claregalway, County Galway, a song called Dubh na Brátaí, the blackening of the potatoes. So one of the few songs referencing the famine or what they would have witnessed during the famine. It doesn't really get into any of the politics much of the famine. It's more a description of the atmosphere as they're leaving to emigrate. So Father Murphy has a page here from an Gael. At intervals in the journal, they would give a sort of an index of some of the contents that have been in the journal in previous editions. And what has happened here is Father Murphy has gone back through the journal and made a note beside the contributions that came from Lyons. And for me, this reflects the esteem in which he held JJ's work, and he's using the journal as part of his scholarship, like his own private library in a sense. He's going back and revisiting these things as he's working with song texts and looking at sort of the song complexes in a way, figuring out does one verse belong to one song or another, etc. So as I say, it's likely that they met at the Philo-Celtic Society in Philadelphia, and the minute book that I referred to earlier, it being referring to members of the society, there would be membership fees, and where there are fees to be collected, there would be addresses of where these people live. So there's an opportunity to map where the members were at various periods through the minute book. And we're looking here at the south side of downtown Philadelphia, where a lot of the Irish community would have been at the time. And just I'd like to point out that there's work like this happening already using different sources. For instance, I'll reference Nicholas Wolf's work at NYU looking at the 1910 US Census, trying to map Irish speakers in Manhattan. You can look it up. It's the Empire City. I should know the title. I'm afraid I don't. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat box. In any case, Nick's work is doing something similar there. So this area of downtown Philadelphia is where Father Murphy was first placed as a curate, I believe, in this church, which no longer stands, St. Teresa's. X marks the spot for where the church was. Father Murphy was just down the street. And then 4 blocks away, the other pin on the map, is where one of his singers was living. And that was Thomas O'Clougherty. And the little scrap of manuscript you see up in the corner there is one of the songs that Thomas sang. And it was actually the very first song that I found from this collection. I found a reference to it, and I took a particular interest in it because it's a song from my own village in the Aran Islands, Oran Hamishi Chrochuit, which would have been sung down to the present day by Joe Heaney, for instance, a song about proselytization. So again, not surprising that a priest would have taken an interest in it. But Thomas, when I saw this first, he had performed 18 verses from memory, because at that point he'd been living in America for 40 years. He'd emigrated around 1852, so he was a famine survivor, got on the boat. 40 years later, he's in Philadelphia, and Father Murphy is his local priest. And a man with 18 verses is likely to be one of those star singers or star performers that might have a core repertoire, and the hunch was right in the sense that there are 40 songs from Thomas O'Clougherty in the collection. I'm sure that list isn't legible, but there is a fair scattering there in any case. And some of them, I'll just name them here: an Cushlan Gyor, an Vinchin Luchra, Bochalin Dasogma, an Sagertin, an Sushin Bon, an Tailchuch, Kurta Trahan Wee, Queenach Glass and Oed. And with a repertoire like this, you might say to yourself, where was he singing? Did he have opportunities to sing? And sometimes we can get evidence of occasions when people would have been singing through Irish. And I'll just read the one in English here for you. This is an extract from a letter from the Tuke emigration scheme. The emigrants who arrived, it was assisted emigration. When they arrived, then they were writing letters back home to indicate how they were getting on. And this letter is from Cleveland in Ohio. Cleveland hosted a lot of people, or received a lot of people from Achill in Mayo, so maybe they're from Achill. But the extract reads: "The night we landed in Cleveland, when we came to Martin's house, Bridget and Hugh did not know what to say when they saw us. We did not sleep any for 2 nights, but dancing and playing, and everyone coming to see us. You would not know BC. She is so big and stout. She has a nice house and is well off." So a positive spin on the emigration experience there. But this is a private gathering by all accounts, and the question then arises, well, what about public gatherings? You know, did people sing in public in a way? So there's an extract here from J.J.'s collecting days, where he says the following song, this is from 1891, is very popular among the natives of Ulster in America. I often heard it sung at weddings, christenings and other social gatherings in the city of Philadelphia. It's written from the dictation of Mr. Con McNeilis, a native of the parish of Inniskeil, County Donegal, and it's Rake Charntil, or Shachran Charntil as it would be called. today. So that's an example of people celebrating new life through Irish in a public setting in a way, and it sort of it contradicts the depiction of the Irish language being a secret language, in a sense, people leaving it on the dockside as soon as they arrive. So this evidence, in a way, the question of 450 singers over however many years, it questions this depiction, and it sheds a bit more light on it, and begs the question, well, has it been simplified to date or oversimplified to date to say that people would simply abandon a language? So, and we shouldn't be surprised at this question or so accepting of received wisdoms in a way, because if we look at diasporic experience today, people living in our own communities who are living in a diasporic existence in a way, many of them are living still with their own languages. So this is an interesting question for me. But just in relation to the question also of the depiction of poverty, you know, the association of the Irish language with poverty, Thomas O'Clougherty, here marked in the census from 1900, he actually owned the house that he was living in, and he was renting the back of the house to an English family. So again, if we start to dig through some of this evidence, we're seeing that things are more complex and richer. And, you know, given that he had left Ireland around aged 18 and had successfully made a life there for himself, it's not quite challenging, but certainly highlighting once again, you know, the statistics will say that the suggestion is that there's a third of Philadelphia Irish were below the poverty line. So it's interesting, I feel, to dig into that a little bit more. So just to show you here, this was an effort to enumerate the song collection when it eventually came to Ireland and came to Galway. It numbers at over 1,200. This was an estimate based on the bundles that had arrived, because when they were stacked, it was brown paper and string, like the packages that came from America long ago. And what you're seeing here is it's just a reminder of the numbers. You know, 1,200 songs, 450 singers. It's not a case of sort of there's no ambiguity there in those figures, I think is the point I'm trying to make. And the volume as well, it tells us another story about the place of song in people's lives, that this was something that they carried with them. There's a poem that Moya Cannon has written, Carrying the Songs, about that idea that people left with nothing but what was in their heads and in their hearts. So that level of engagement and sustained engagement is evidenced as well in this collection. So just I thought I might give you an example of one of the song manuscripts and what it looks like. And I have here Molly Machuig Vila Gra, echoing the Molly Maguires that would have been in eastern Pennsylvania and all of that history as well. And this material, though it dates slightly afterwards, it's quite likely that the people occurring in this collection would have been witnesses, at least, to what was happening in eastern Pennsylvania at that time. This song here was performed by William O'Donnell, or Liam O'Donnell, from Rannaferste in Donegal, and I have to thank Lila Solida for helping to identify this man really by his repertoire, his song repertoire, because he contributed over 70 songs to the collection. It's the most significant contribution from an individual, and he would be related to Clon Vigriana, the writers and song makers, etc. in the locality up around Rannaferste. So an interesting insight into how song can serve as an aid in trying to trace people and who they are and where they're from, because Kebolesha, and as we say. So Liam was living in Audenried in Carbon County, and his niece, Ellen O'Donnell, and I don't know, was she born in America or in Ireland, but she also has songs in the collection. So we have here, you saw there, just the previous one was handwritten. The next one is an Irish language typeface, which is from the typewriter that Father Murphy had. He was one of the first people to have an Irish language typewriter, according to Gael. He had it by 1892. And as you can see, it's there's a few things going on here. It helps for clarity's sake to see the print as opposed to the handwriting, but there's also a lot of editing and correcting going on there as well. And I suspect that this related as well to disputes with editors. This third image here is, we've had the transcription of the song there, first in pen, then the type, and now it's Údar an Óran, the story behind the song, where Liam got it, what the song is about. So this is the level of detail we have for many of the transcriptions in the collection. And that density of material is particularly attractive to us when we consider what you might want to do with these digitally. For digital projects, you need scale, you need lots of material, but you also need a lot of data, a lot of detail, and this collection has both. So it's a very strong candidate for developing via digital humanities and linking with other projects. And for me, the more time I spend with this story and consider what was driving the people that were spending so much time handwriting, a lot of these things are typing, etc., on thin, cheap paper. There's an element of obsession, you might say, given the nature of the paper. It's grabbing scraps of paper to notate or transcribe a song as the opportunity arose. But the potential of this collection to answer those two questions that I highlighted at the start, discoverability and accessibility, is very strong. I wanted to show you here just the range of orthographies as well that we would have to deal with in looking at some of this material, whether it's Irish language orthography or English as well. So another interesting challenge. And I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to leave anything important out. I have here a letter round about 1898 that Father Murphy is contributing to in Gael, and it's another song here. But what's interesting is the address. It's St. Agnes's Hospital in Philadelphia. He wasn't a chaplain in the hospital, so the assumption is that he was then a patient of the hospital. And then around 1901 or so, he sort of goes off grid. It's difficult to trace exactly where he was, but from the letters, postmarks, dates, etc., his relatives from Pittsburgh, the descendants, I've met them when they came to Ireland, and we were looking at the materials in the archive together. And they pointed out that the addresses in Philadelphia, they would have been poor parts of Philadelphia. So he wasn't a priest with an order. He was just an ordinary priest in a way. And he doesn't appear to have had a parish, or else there's no record of it in any case. So a bit of a mystery there yet to be solved. But also to notice there is the fact that he's marking in red corrections. He has received the journal, that it's already in print, etc., but he's sort of going back over it and finding fault with the editing that's been done to his submission, including his own name being misspelled, something I can relate with. But that is something that occurs again and again, going back over and correcting things. The other correspondence he has include other collectors, Thorna, based in Cork, Tygo Donoghue, who was a collector, Douglas Hyde, Ireland's first president, who also was a collector and had published Love Songs of Connacht, among other items. And we see here he's in correspondence with them. And also there's an interesting letter here to Owen MacNeill. And Owen McNeill was the editor of Idish Leabhar na Gaeilge for a period, and this letter refers to, he's contributing an item to him, some 3 songs, he says, but he references the fact that they may possibly be generating a dictionary of the Irish language. And the translation here, he says, if you believe the words in them are too obscene to be propagated, these are the words in the songs, you can replace them with more appropriate words. If you are compiling a Gaelic dictionary, you ought to have every word there is in Irish, be it good or bad. This is an interesting reflection on his own personality, because other collectors who were priests sometimes were inclined to edit questionable lyrics out of songs. But here it would appear that Murphy is quite diligent about transcribing the song as he receives it, and not necessarily editing it on moral grounds. So there's a loyalty to the language and to the compositions there. That's an interesting distinction. Towards the end of his life, he was with the Augustinians in Villanova University in the library. At this point, I'd say he's less mobile, and he's now working with manuscript material that was already in the library, because there would have been some Irish language materials that would have come, immigrants would have brought them to America, and that's how many of them ended up over there. And what they're doing sometimes is transcribing copies of these manuscripts and sending them back to Ireland, because the technology wasn't there until a little bit later to photocopy or photograph them, or photostat or whichever that was coming in just around the 1930 or so. It started to appear. So Father Jan passes away in 1935, and there is now a headstone over his grave. There wasn't, as you can see from when this photograph was taken. I must thank the Murphy family in general for their generosity in sharing information, family memories and photographs as well, since I first met them back in 2012. So that has been a real privilege. So at this point, when he dies, there's no will. So there's some time before the issue of his estate as it was, but including the manuscripts, was resolved, and the manuscripts were shipped to Galway, and to the university in Galway specifically. The reason for that was because the professor of Irish in Galway was Thomas O'Malley, and he himself was a collector. He was also the editor of an Irish language newspaper called An Stock, produced in the university, and he was also collecting with recordings, first with manuscripts, but he had acquired a recording machine as well. So quite active in this space. His field was linguistics, but he was very interested in folkloric material as well. He and his brother had been collecting folklore from the early 20th century at least. And he was from Connemara himself, so from Dúigheoigheach. So he was the one to receive the manuscripts in a sense, but the connection had been actually established in the 1920s because Father Murphy's series of An Gael, the journal that he had been buying over the years, he deposited it in the University Library in Galway in 1927. So it makes sense that the manuscripts would have followed the journal to Galway, because they're interwoven. There are references throughout. There's lots of marginalia in the journals that connect with what's in the manuscript. So really they have to be considered as all part of the one project in a way. So we have in mind ideally to digitize it if we can. So the point that we're at now is to consider the possibilities for this. So recently the Galway University Foundation have agreed to try to secure a donor to support the development of this collection. What I'm showing you here is a very early prototype website. It's a number of years old now, as you can tell from the design, to see how we might develop the collection. and that's a map showing some of the origins in Ireland. It was with a very small sample size, so it's in no way reflective of the entirety. But here, maybe just you can see along the top there, the first song collected from a Mrs. Gibbons. She was in her 80s or 80 years of age when she was singing the song, which was, as I recall now, probably an Ropin Quail Knaube, the hemp rope. So it refers to a hanging after the year of the French, 1798, up in Mayo, and she was related to the man who was hanged. So that's a very interesting connection to have a source transcribed in America reaching back into the 18th century, back in Ireland, through song and with song, and an almost a political act in a way for her to claim what had occurred all those years ago. So there's potential as well to connect, as we can see here, people are coming from Acres in County Donegal to Bristol, Pennsylvania, Ranna to Wardenreid, etc., the chain routes. But there's also the possibility of connecting this particular collection with other resources and other collections. So here's one example. There's a man named Pádraig McMenamin from Ballycroy, County Mayo, pinned there on the map. And his folklore and folk tales as well were documented by the National Folklore Collection in Dublin, and also by the Dugan Project there, as you can see. There's a lady in Father Murphy's collection. She's Bridget Murray Nay McMenamin, Ballycroy, County Mayo. So I wonder if they're siblings, if they're cousins, etc. So huge possibilities there in terms of connecting these multiple sources. So as I mentioned, we have a plan to digitize this collection and make it available everywhere, and to do it in a way that makes the most of the level of detail and the scale that it represents. And as I say, bringing us back to the point that Hugh Shields made about reflecting seriously on the best use that can be made of musical archives. I mean, as musicians, we're interested in the sounds and the rhythms and the stories that are in all of the songs, but I'm interested in developing this collection in a way that makes it useful to far more, as many people as possible, whether they're interested in genealogy or they're interested in the history of the labour movement in the States. The possibilities really are endless, I would say. So I'd like to thank you for your time this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions that you all might have, and we'll see if we can answer as many of them as possible this evening. So, good evening, Maggie.
School